April 8, 1943. Midnight. A drizzle slicked the cobblestones of Rua du Alacrim in Lisbon, and the lamps threw halos across puddles that smelled faintly of diesel and seaweed. Inside a narrow, third-floor flat above a tailor's shop, Oberleutnant Heinrich Adler sat at a battered oak table under a single swinging bulb. The flat smelled of tobacco and cold coffee. Rain tapped a slow rat-a-tat against the window. On the table lay a blue envelope, its flap sealed with a thin strip of wax and a neat, indifferent stamp of the abwehr. Adler's hands were ink-stained from transcribing reports all week. He had the face of a man who'd learned to sleep with one eye open, a square jaw softened by premature creases, hair threaded with gray, and eyes that scanned a paper as if expected to move. Beside the envelope, a battered Leica camera, a small field notebook, and a penciled list of names, mechanics, foremen, a steward on a transatlantic liner, told the story of how information had come to him, not in a single brilliant stroke, but as a slow accretion of whispered details, bribes, and favors. Intelligence did not arrive as a revelation here. It arrived as ink. He slit the wax with a pocket knife. Inside were 3 sheets typed by a contact calling himself Morris, a machinist who'd once worked at a Boeing subcontractor and now tended to engines for Pan Am crews. The telegrams were clinical, precise, and impossible to dismiss. New bomber, pressurized cabin, remote turret for large radial engines, transoceanic range. The word that seemed to pulse from the paper was Superfortress. Adler read it twice, then aloud, as if tasting the syllable, Superfortress. Outside, a tram clanked by. Upstairs, someone coughed. Adler had seen many American machines in his life. Grumman fighters in shipping manifests. B-17s crossing the Atlantic like iron bird. But the descriptions here were different. Pressurized cabin. Morris had written in a cramped, jittery hand in the margins. Crew sits in comfort at 30,000 feet. Engines, big one. Wright R-3350, they call them. Turrets controlled by sight, linked in a way that the gunner doesn't have to handle every jam himself. The words were both technical and awesomely banal, the language of mechanics that breeds innovations into weapons. He pushed back his chair with a scraped groan and walked to the window. The Tagus River lay black and reflective, a seam between continents. He thought of Berlin, the concrete offices of the abwehr, the clipped voices of captains and colonels who preferred tidy diagrams to messy human testimony. He pictured the map rooms and the ledger books where every piece of information was given a stamp and a priority. He knew how such documents vanished into bureaucratic appetite. Very often, the most dangerous reports were the ones that sounded like fantasy. Adler made his call to the courier. The man arrived an hour later, a threadbare Portuguese sailor named Joachim, who smelled of brine and brandy and moved with the roguish economy of someone who had learned to love 2 survival skills, silence and luck. Joachim tucked the blue envelope into the inside of his coat and left with a nod that was almost a prayer. By morning, the report would be on a ship bound for Spain, then by rail to Hendaye and across the Reich. It would be handled by men who measured truth in tonnage and timetable. But this was not merely a file to Adler. He had seen the diagram scribbled by Morris, a fuselage long and clean, a cockpit with curved glass like a submarine's bridge, fuel tanks that hung under wings like pods, a wingspan that made hangars look small. He had seen a pencil note that spoke of an operational ceiling and a target range that could carry payloads to an island the size of Japan, further than most had believed possible for a bomber with a crew aboard. When he closed his eyes, he could feel the rumble of those engines as if he'd stood on a cold field and watched such a machine climb. Heinrich Adler was not a romantic. He had been trained to be precise and unemotional. His report back to Berlin would be measured, source reliability, corroborations, the exact language of mechanic. He would note where Morris had been wrong in the past, and where his fact had lined up with other fragments. But the more he read, the clearer a single, terrifying idea crystallized. This was not merely a new bomber. This was a platform that could change the geometry of war in the Pacific, a bomber that could fly higher than current interceptors, farther than most escort fighters could cross, and carry a payload large enough to make a new class of strategic strikes practical. He set the blue envelope aside and opened a fresh sheet. He wrote with a hand steady from years of practice, and he did something the abwehr often forgot to do. He predicted, if these reports are corroborated, he wrote, and if the range and ceiling are as described, Japanese defenses will face an aircraft they cannot easily intercept. Long-range strategic bombing from U.S. soil to the Japanese home island could become operational within the next 18 months. He underlined the sentence once, twice. Outside, the rain began to ease. A lamplight flickered. The city breathed. Adler sealed his own report and stamped it with a small emblem. That meant it was for Hochst Aufmerksamkeit, highest attention. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl like a question mark. Intelligence, he knew, was nothing without action. It was action steered by men who had other priorities, resources, politics, ego. He folded the report into the blue envelope with a deliberateness that felt ceremonial. Somewhere in Berlin, a captain would glance at the paper, make a note, and perhaps decide this was a story for a later meeting. In a war measured by the weight of metal and the speed of engine, reports like Adler's sometimes swallowed unanswered. Tonight, he would push his claim into the current and trust that it would not be left to sink. May 2nd, 1943. Berlin, Germany. The rain in Lisbon had long since become a rumor by the time the blue envelope reached the concrete heart of the Reich. It arrived at Abwehr headquarters on Terpitzhofer, passed between gloved hands and carbon copy, stamped 3 times before landing on a desk marked Technische Aufklärung, America. The man who opened it was Major Heinrich Voss, an intelligence officer known less for imagination than for obedience. The office smelled of ink, stale smoke, and the faint hum of a radio tuned to static between military frequencies. Voss adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and began reading the typed pages from Oberleutnant Adler, his brow furrowed slightly at the word Superfortress. The report spoke of a new American bomber, a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled turrets, an operational ceiling of over 30,000 feet. There were sketches, crude but suggestive, showing a sleek, high-wing aircraft far larger than the B-17. Voss sighed. It was late, and the corridors outside were filled with the muffled footsteps of junior clerks rushing toward canteens and mess lines. He had seen reports like this before. Wild claims about Allied superweapons, British tanks that could swim, American bombers that could cross the Atlantic without refueling. Most of them, he thought, were just propaganda that had seeped into the intelligence stream, carried by frightened civilians or ambitious field agents hoping for promotion. He wrote a note in the margin, source unverified, possible exaggeration. Still, he flipped the next page. Adler's conclusions were sharp, almost prophetic. A bomber of this range and altitude would neutralize Japanese defensive doctrine, as current interceptors cannot engage above 32,000 feet. Voss read it twice. Then he laughed softly. Not mockery, but disbelief. Germany had been developing the Heinkel He-177, a so-called strategic bomber that barely stayed in the air without catching fire. The Luftwaffe was obsessed with the Eastern Front and tactical bombing. Strategic theory belonged to dreamers like General Weaver, long dead in an accident. He closed the file, exhaled, and reached for his pen. The report would be forwarded to the Reich Air Ministry, but not with priority. He stamped it wahrscheinlich Gering, probability low. By the time Adler's intelligence reached RLM's technical department, the war had already shifted beneath Germany's feet. The Allies had landed in North Africa. U-boats were being hunted mercilessly in the Atlantic, and the skies over the Ruhr burned nightly from RAF bombers. The idea of an American super bomber seemed distant, a problem for another continent, another war. Weeks later, in a conference room lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs, Voss's summary report was read aloud during a briefing for Oberst Hans Reiter, one of Göring's staff officers. Reiter leaned back, puffing on his cigarette, the smoke curling in blue ribbons toward the ceiling. A pressurized bomber, 30,000 feet? Impossible, he scoffed. Even the Americans can't build that kind of engine reliability. Their B-17s already push limit. This sounds like a fairy tale. The room murmured agreement. Another officer joked that perhaps the Americans were inventing planes in Hollywood now. Laughter followed, the kind that comes not from confidence, but denial. The blue envelope, still bearing Adler's name, was quietly reclassified and filed under Vernaufklärung, Nick Dringend, long-range reconnaissance, not urgent. Adler would never know this. In Lisbon, he waited for acknowledgement, but none came. The days stretched into weeks, then months. Occasionally, he received coded replies. Report received, under review, the bureaucratic equivalent of silent. Yet he kept sending update, new details on engines, tail designs, rumors from dock workers in California. Each dispatch built the same picture, an aircraft capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of bombs over 3,000 miles. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in Wichita and Seattle, factories worked day and night under blinding lamps. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was no myth. It was real. It was already taking shape in steel, aluminum, and sweat. By the summer of 1944, test flights were reaching 32,000 feet. In the Pacific, engineers were calculating routes from Saipan and Tinian that could strike Japan's heartland. The machine Adler had warned about was rising into clouds, unseen, unchallenged, and unstoppable. In Berlin, as sirens wailed during another Allied raid, Major Voss would occasionally think of that report. He remembered the line Adler had underlined. If corroborated, this platform could alter the balance of the Pacific War. He never said it aloud, But sometimes, as he stared at the night sky lit by British incendiary, he wondered if that balance had already shifted. June 15, 1944, the Mariana Island. The first sunlight spilled across the coral airfields of Saipan, glinting off silver fuselages that stretched in endless rows like a metallic horizon. Mechanics in sweat-soaked shirts moved between them, shouting over the roar of idling engine. On the tail fins gleamed bold white letter, B-29 Superfortress. To the Japanese lookouts on distant ridges, the shapes seemed unreal. Enormous aircraft, larger than any bomber they had ever seen. The engines, from massive Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, churned the air with low thunder that rolled across the island like a gathering storm. In the cockpit of one aircraft, Captain Robert Bob Klein, commander of the 497 Bomb Group, adjusted his oxygen mask. The altimeter needle climbed steadily. 20,000 feet, 25,000, then 30,000. The cabin pressure held steady. The crew could breathe easily, a luxury unknown to bomber crews before them. He looked out the glass nose where the sun burned orange above the Pacific and said quietly into his headset, "Gentlemen, you are now flying the most advanced bomber in the world." Behind him, the gunners manned remote sighting system, small plexiglass domes filled with gyroscopic optic. The actual guns were mounted in turrets controlled electrically, tracking targets by analog computation. To an enemy pilot, the B-29 seemed to bristle with invisible fang. That morning, they weren't flying toward Germany or occupied France. They were heading west toward the island of Yada, home to one of Japan's largest steelworks. The mission was to test range, endurance, and the machine's ability to hit the mainland from newly captured positions. It was the first time Japan would see what America's super bomber could truly do. At 31,000 feet, the bomb bay doors opened. The air rushed and trembled. Dozens of 500-pound bombs fell silently for seconds before striking the Yada ironwork. The explosions flickered across the ground like lightning trapped in the earth. Below, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners fired desperately into empty sky. Their shells burst hundreds of meters below the bombers. Harmless puffs of smoke dissolving in the blue. Tokyo's air defense network had no answer. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and Nakajima-ki 44 interceptors clawed for altitude, but they could barely reach the bombers before their engines strained and stalled. The few that did reach the formation found themselves outgunned. The B-29's remote turrets met them with precise, stabilized fire from Browning .50 calibers. A Japanese pilot later described the moment. "We climbed until our wings shuddered. We fired at shadow, and then the shadows fired back." In Berlin, buried deep in the concrete warren of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a small intelligence unit intercepted the translated Japanese dispatches. They described enormous bombers operating beyond interception altitude, engines that ran without overheating, crews that flew for hours over Japan untouched. The cables reached Major Voss's office. He read them in silence. The words might as well have been carved from ice. Enemy bomber believed to be American. Altitude approximately 9,500 meters. No interceptors could engage effectively. He leaned back his chair and closed his eyes. He remembered Adler's report, the neat margins, the underlined sentence. A bomber this range and altitude would neutralize Japanese defenses, the very line he had dismissed 14 months earlier. By late 1944, B-29s were no longer rare sighting. They filled the skies above Japan, firebombing cities with ruthless precision. Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya burned in nights so bright that survivors swore they saw shadows cast by the flame. Factories vanished. Rail hubs melted. Tokyo itself became a sea of ember. In the charred remains of Tokyo's military command center, Japanese officers read their own reports in disbelief. Descriptions of bombers immune to their guns, flying from islands once thought too distant to matter. Their most advanced interceptor, the Ki-84 could barely graze the edge of their altitude. On the other side of the world, Heinrich Adler, now working quietly in neutral Switzerland under a false name, saw the headlines in a Zurich cafe. "New American bomber devastates Japanese city." The accompanying photograph showed a Superfortress on a runway, its polished metal glinting like a blade in sunlight. He set down the paper and stared out the window, the same rain-gray sky as Lisbon a year before reflected in the glass. Somewhere in that gleam, he saw the ghost of his blue envelope, unopened, unread, buried in some Berlin archive. He didn't need confirmation anymore. The machine he had tried to warn them about was no longer an idea. It was the sound of thunder over Tokyo. March 9th, 1945. Tokyo, Japan. The night began with a soft wind blowing in from Tokyo Bay. By dawn, that wind would carry the stench of ash, oil, and human sorrow across the Pacific. Above the blacked-out city at 1 a.m., the first wave of B-29 Superfortresses appeared, over 300 of them, flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, their formation so wide it seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. Inside B-29, the general's mistress, Captain Klein, tightened his harness. The crew was silent except for the crackle of the intercom and the whine of the R-3350. This mission was different. Not high-altitude precision, but a low-level firebomb raid. They had stripped out most of their defensive guns to carry more fuel and more bombs. 6,000 pounds of M69 incendiary clusters, each designed to burst into sticky, flaming jellied gasoline that clung to wood and flesh alike. At 5,000 feet, Tokyo lay below like a patchwork of wooden roofs, narrow streets, and sleeping families. The bomb bay doors yawned open. Then, one by one, the bombs fell. For the first few seconds, there was only silence. Then chaos. A wave of fire rippled out. The incendiaries ignited rooftop, then alleys, then entire district. The heat built so rapidly that it created its own storm, a roaring cyclone that tore through the city, feeding itself with oxygen as it went. Fire leapt from building to building, crossing rivers in sheets of flame. People fled toward canals only to find the water boiling. Within hours, Tokyo was burning at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. From the sky, the crews could see the glow even as they turned for a home, a living ocean of flame that reached upward in pillars of smoke 20,000 feet high. The heat buffeted their aircraft like invisible fists. One gunner whispered over the radio, "My God, it's hell itself down there." Back in Europe, in the bunker of the Reich Air Ministry, the Japanese military attaché's latest telegram arrived at 0900 hours on March 11th. It described the Tokyo raid in clinical, almost stunned precision. City destroyed by incendiaries. B-29 formations operated unopposed. Defensive measures ineffective. Major Erich Voss stared at the words until they blurred. Around him, the once proud machinery of the German state was collapsing. Allied troops had crossed the Rhine. The Red Army was advancing from the east. Yet, for him, this line from Tokyo was a quieter, colder defeat. It was the sound of an intelligence warning turning to prophecy. He rummaged through his old files, dust-covered folders tied in red string. Finally, he found it. Adler, Heinrich, report number 448, B, new American long-range bomber. The paper had yellowed slightly. He ran a finger along the underlined passage. If corroborated, this aircraft could enable sustained strategic bombing of Japan from Pacific bases. He sat for a long while before whispering, "You were right." In Zurich, Adler read of the same raid in the morning papers. Photographs of Tokyo's ruins filled the front page. Columns of smoke, silhouettes of children against a wall of fire. The reporter called it a storm of man-made lightning. Adler felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He had tried to change the course of events, but in war, truth was not always a weapon. Sometimes it was a curse that no one wanted to hear. By mid-1945, the B-29 had become a symbol of inevitability. It flattened Japanese industry, then turned to cities. Each sortie seemed to erase another chapter of resistance. And then in August came the missions that would end the war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, both delivered from the belly of the very machine Berlin had dismissed as fantasy. When the world saw the blinding flash over Hiroshima, few remembered that 2 years earlier, in a rainy apartment in Lisbon, a weary German spy had warned of exactly this kind of power, a machine that could reach across ocean, over every defense, to strike at the heart of nations. In the end, the B-29 Superfortress was not merely an airplane. It was a messenger, a harbinger of the future Adler had seen coming, and his superiors had chosen to ignore. As the war ended and cities smoldered, the surviving B-29s taxied home, their metal skins scorched by their own firestorm. The crews disembarked in silence, their boots touching the earth as if uncertain whether they were stepping onto victory or the ashes of humanity itself. And somewhere, tucked away in the ruins of Berlin, a blue envelope still lay buried beneath the rubble, a silent testament to the cost of disbelief.